Hey, good morning, students at Foothills Theology Bible 301 class. This is Mr. McDonald coming to you live from my backyard. And some of you guys were in class when I read from this book the other day. Some of you weren't, and some of you didn't get the full reading. So I just wanted to take a second and make a little video for you guys and do this full reading for you guys. Since we are talking about logical proofs of God's existence, and we have assigned a project on it, and you guys are working on posters. Some of you guys are doing the moral argument. I thought it would be cool to read this section of a book that I'm reading, a memoir from Andrew Klavan. And it was interesting because the very day that I signed your projects for the proof of God's existence, I read a section in this book where he talks about the seeds, the logical seeds of the moral argument were kind of planted in him when he was in his undergrad and college. And because that was implanted in him, years later, decades later, he actually became a Christian and converted just logically because he couldn't get away from the truth of God's existence. So because I signed it and we talked about the moral argument and it was in a book I was personally reading, I thought it would be cool to share with you guys. Also because our culture is going through a hard time right now in our country, and a lot of people are confused and don't understand the merits of each side and what's going on. And but it has a lot to do with postmodernism, and he talks about postmodernism and moral relativism in this section. So I just wanted to bring it up. So if I could read it to you guys, this is from The Great Good Thing by Andrew Klavan, a man who I admire intellectually, and we're going to start reading on page 133. He's talking about his undergrad experience at Cal Berkeley. He says, I went to college just as the ideas often called postmodernism were rising up through the educational system. Up to that time, under modernism, academics and intellectuals had considered themselves to be participating in a great conversation, an interchange that carried on across the centuries by the major thinkers and the artists of the Western canon. The idea was that by studying this conversation, you could move closer to truth and so find a fuller wisdom about reality and what made for the good life. Now, though, those intellectuals who derided and even denounced the Western canon and Western values in general had come to the fore. Literature was no longer to be loved and learned from, but deconstructed to reveal its secret prejudices and power plays. Language itself was now considered not a rude tool for transmitting meaning, but a political instrument of imperialism and oppression that needed radical criticism. The very idea of truth was being rejected. All morals were relative, all cultures equally legitimate. These professors who had studied literature under the old system were on the defensive and had lost their confidence. This is talking about the early 70s in Berkeley. Back to the book. I remember sitting in a class on Alfred Lord Tennyson, a poet of the highest genius, who often comes under attack now for his Victorian values. The professor was lecturing to an auditorium full of students about The Charge of the Light Brigade. This poem is a brilliant description of a disastrous but courageous charge on a Russian cannon emplacement by 600 British cavalrymen in 1854 during the Crimean War. He's going to cite the poem here for you. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. The professor, a mild-mannered woman in her 40s, was discussing the poem with gentle enthusiasm when a very serious young lady in a very serious pair of spectacles rose from one of the front seats and demanded angrily, "How can we even read this poem when all it does is glorify war?" The professor's face went blank. Clearly, she was a product of the old school. She studied literature because she loved literature, not because she wanted to use it to preen herself on her own political virtue. She had never had to defend the beauty of beauty before, or the wisdom of wisdom. She smiled, embarrassed. She shrugged weakly. "I see what you mean," she said. At the back of the auditorium, I leapt to my feet, appalled. Here was a poem I'd actually read, and I loved it. Still do, because it's great. Inarticulate with passion, I began to slap open my volume of Tennyson with the back of my hand, reading the opening lines aloud and saying, "Listen! Listen to this! Listen! Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. You can hear the horses! You can listen! You can feel the courage and the madness, everything, it's all there!" I babbled on like that for a few more seconds and then dropped back into my seat, blushing, feeling like an idiot. The professor made a bland gesture in my general direction as if to say, "Yes, yes, I suppose it's something of that sort," and then continued with her lecture. Such survivors from the old days could raise no defense against the postmodern onslaught. Myself, I could see the logic behind postmodernism and its moral relativism. Much of what we think is good, individual freedom, equality before the law, tolerance for conflicting opinions, is learned from Western culture and taken on faith. Why should we not accept that other cultures with other values and other faiths might be just as legitimate as our own? I could see the logic, and yet my senses rebelled. To abandon those basic principles seemed false to something equally basic within me. It seemed an act of violence against my idea of what a human being was. I was torn between the intellectual fashion of the day and my own deepest convictions. That's part of the reason why Hamlet obsessed me so. It was a story of a man who could not decide what was right, what was true. I read it first in a Shakespeare course and read it again and watched many of the movie versions too. One scene, the mad scene, haunted me endlessly. Hamlet is pretending to be insane, and may actually be a little insane at that point. When he's asked what he's reading, and he answers weirdly, words, words, words. He talks about how his internal moods seem to transform outer reality, so that he can never be sure of what the world is really like. Morality especially has come to seem to him completely dependent on his own opinions. There is nothing, either good or bad, but thinking makes it so, he says. How wild was this? Shakespeare had predicted postmodernism and moral relativism hundreds of years before they came into being. Like Hamlet, the postmodernists were declaring that language did not describe the world around us. It was just words, words, words. Like Hamlet, the postmodernists announced that what we thought was reality was just a construct of our minds that needed to be disassembled in order to be truly understood. And like Hamlet, the postmodernists had dismissed the notion of absolute morality. There is nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. There was one big difference. Hamlet said these things when he was pretending to be mad. My professors said them and pretended to be sane. Shakespeare was telling us, it seemed to me, that relativism was not just crazy, it was make-believe crazy. Because even the people who proclaimed it did not believe it deep down. If, after all, there is no truth, how can it be true that there is no truth? If there is no absolute morality, how can you condemn the morality of considering my culture better than another? Relativism made no sense, and Shakespeare clearly saw. But what was the answer then? On one hand, it seemed prejudiced and dogmatic to cling to moral absolutes. On the other hand, relativism was self-contradictory, mad scene gibberish. As a writer who wanted to describe reality, how could I steer between the craziness of postmodernism and the rigidity of self-righteous self-certainty? The seed of the answer was planted in me by Dostoevsky's novel Crime and Punishment. I was about 20 when I read it. It changed my life. I had moved out of Berkeley by then and was commuting to my classes from across the San Francisco Bay. I had a dingy little apartment in one of those pretty cities, pretty hills. A street of townhouses with bay windows. The cable car bells ringing in the near distance. I still didn't do much schoolwork, but I read more of the books I bought now and read a broader range of books than ever. I had learned how to turn off my ever so insistent opinions and simply let the authors speak to me. I'd learned to ride a story like a wave wherever it went. This was an important change in me, an essential change. Stories are not just entertainment, not to me. It teaches us what it's like to be who we are. Nothing but art can do this. There is no science that can capture the inner life. No words can describe it directly. We can only speak of it in metaphors. We can only say it's like this story, this picture, this song. I had finally sloughed off some of my teenage arrogance and started to listen to those descriptions with an open mind. Without knowing it, I had joined the great conversation. So, I remember sitting in my San Francisco apartment one evening, sitting in a rickety, straight-backed wooden chair at my little writing desk. The paperback Crime and Punishment was open like a prayer book in my two hands, held under the desk lamp. The lamplight was dim. I had to stare at the small print on the page through the deepening dusk. I stared, my eyes wide, my lips parted. I read, Crime and Punishment of the story of Raskolnikov, there you go, a former college student, sunken-eyed, feverish, half-crazed, depressive. He reminded me of me when I first arrived at school. Raskolnikov, I'm going to have to delete this and start over, comes to believe that morality is relative and that a great man can create his own right and wrong in the name of freedom and power. In the grips of that belief, he commits two horrific murders. Then, too late, he discovers that he has violated the absolute moral law within himself. This is the moral law, the moral proof of God's existence. It was real all along, much more real than he knew. His conscience would not let him rest. He is tortured by remorse, but slowly he comes under the sway of a Christian girl who has fallen into prostitution. Through her love and kindness and faith, Raskolnikov begins to accept his sinfulness and shame and to return to the moral world. As the story ends, he begins the new story of his redemption in the Gospels. When I finished the book, I laid it down on the desktop, my hand unsteady. I pressed the heels of my palms against my forehead as if to keep my thoughts inside me. After reading that novel, I was never quite the same. I did not accept the Christian aspect of it. I couldn't. It was too alien to my upbringing, too at odds with the mental atmosphere in which I lived. I told myself that Dostoevsky was merely using Christ as a symbol for the reality of moral truth, but never mind. I knew beyond a doubt that the essential vision of the novel was valid. The story's rightness struck me broadside so that the journey of my heart changed directions. From the moment I read Crime and Punishment, though I did not know it, though it took me decades, though I was lost on 1,000 detours along the way, I was traveling away from the moral relativism and towards truth, toward faith, toward God. Excellent. And he converted, I think, at 49, so about 3 decades later. Thanks for sticking through. If you guys listened to that whole quote, I think it was just an excellent portrayal of a guy who was in a similar cultural situation than we're at today, where we're seeing people distorting what is true and what is morally right for the sake of their own political agendas. And it was actually through the classics and through just a reflection of the gospel, not even the gospels directly, but just somebody referencing Christ in a story, that in that moral argument, that moral proof that God exists, that penetrated his heart, and it said it changed the direction of his life, and eventually it landed him right where he should be, which is in the faith. So God bless you guys. I hope you're having a great day, and hope you enjoy that little clip. Bless you guys.